I really appreciate your presence in honoring my father. My father was one of those great men that comes around only once in a while. He would never say such a thing about himself, of course, because he was really self-effacing and he knew he had a number of faults and was far from perfect and struggled with himself. But anyone could see that he was a rare man. We were lucky to have him for as long as we did, even though it wasn't long enough. And my siblings and I were really fortunate to have him as the kind, expansive, inspiring father that he was. The past weeks while my dad was hospitalized and then in hospice, it rained and stormed incessantly as my father finally left this plane of existence. The Dylan Thomas poem came to mind more than once. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. My dad was such a bright light. And it was as though the heavens raged against the dying of that light. Who was this man that he should shine so brightly? To know him, you'd have to know the context he came from. Bahman K was born in Tabriz, Iran on February 12, 1929, the year of the Great Depression. His mother, Mehrbanu, was one of the very few pioneering women who graduated from the American school in Tehran and had been selected as a young woman to ceremonially take off the chador on stage during Reza Shah's campaign to liberate women from compulsory veiling. My grandfather, Bahman's father, was an enterprising man who had headed the first national bank of Iran as part of Reza Shah's attempt to free Iran from the stranglehold of Russia and Britain. A fluke accident was responsible for the bank burning, and Reza Shah, thinking it was part of a conspiracy, had my grandparents exiled to Tabriz, where my father was eventually born. The exile just about broke my grandfather's spirit, and my father was born at the time when light was needed more than ever in his family and on the planet. My grandparents eventually returned to Tehran, where my grandfather ran for office as the Zoroastrian representative to the Iranian parliament. My father was 7 then, learning to play the violin. His father had promised to buy him his own violin on his birthday, that coming February. Before the elections, my grandfather was to catch pneumonia, and on New Year's Eve, he died, a young man in his early 40s, leaving my grandmother with 4 young children under the age of 9. My father was never to get his violin. There was a time when I was a young child that I remember trying to save my pennies so that I could buy my dad a violin for his birthday. That story made me so sad. As the oldest son, my dad learned to take on responsibility young. He once described to me how he was sent out by his mother, my grandmother, to stand in line early in the morning to get bread for the entire family. He was only 8 or 9, World War II was on the horizon, and in line with him in Tehran, streets were Russian and Polish refugees. Everyone was hungry, everyone was scared. Imagine, it's the Great Depression. You are part of a minority faith, highly discriminated against, and your father has died, leaving your mother alone with 4 young children in a deeply male-dominated society. Many of you who are Zoroastrian understand what I'm talking about. No wonder my dad had always been concerned for the disadvantaged, and particularly women everywhere, advocating for women's education and rights, and has had a deep instinctive revulsion for patriarchy. He saw what his mother had to overcome. His mother eventually sent him to India with 2 siblings to be educated under the care of a Zoroastrian patron. That was during India's independence movement, and my dad was to be deeply influenced by Gandhi. He worked incredibly hard, eventually got his PhD in economics from the University of Bombay, and this is where he met my mother, the love of his life, Simin Tirandazian, who had also been sent to India as an adolescent to be educated. When we were growing up in the US, my father would always buy secondhand cars and rarely lavished any luxuries on himself. He loved art and music and was generous and abundant with us, but also didn't seem to need much money or anything to make himself happy. I remember asking him about that. Other men of his stature drove fancy cars. Why didn't he? He reminded me that when he was studying in India, he had lived in a converted chicken coop, and he had been very comfortable there. For those who knew my dad, he appreciated simplicity, no fuss, calling himself a Darvish and a Gandhian to the end. My dad was a development economist. He eventually returned to Iran, got work in the Plan Organization, and devoted himself to helping his country. In the early 60s, he was to receive a much-coveted fellowship to attend Harvard for a year. This was the era of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and he fell in love with this country, aspired to bring his family here. He loved freedom and what this country represented. And he told me that during the year, he realized he wanted to raise his children here. He had the talent and foresight to get a job as an economist in the World Bank and brought all of us out of Iran in 1966, years before the revolution. He was not anyone who could stomach any type of dictatorship. There's a lot more to the story of my dad's life of service. You can read a little a bit about it. Do we have a handbook? I think we had a handbook somewhere. But in any case, it's on the website. Late in life, after my dad retired, he wanted to create a blog, but never did. He wanted the blog to be called something like Letters from Baba. My children, his grandchildren by then, were calling him Baba. And for those of you non-Iranians, Baba means father. I try to imagine what Baba would have said in his letters to young people, young Iranians. It's hard to imagine because, first of all, my father would never preach. He was all about giving us children the freedom to choose ourselves and never imposed any ideas on us. If anything, he tended to teach by example. But if Baba were to say something, what would he tell us? What kind of father was my dad? What kind of Baba was he? For me, my father represented the field of infinite possibilities. I was a bit of a wild child, open to exploring, and he never tried to curtail or tame me. When adventures beckoned, or I wanted to do something that seemed big or felt out of reach, he would always encourage me on. Nothing seemed too audacious. He'd also ask me something I now ask myself. If money weren't an issue, what would you do? And so I did them. I reached for the stars, and more than not, I got there. And somehow the resources I needed always came my way. So what would Baba say to us now? He'd say, what is your dream? What is your passion? What makes your heart sing? If you had everything you needed, what would you do? Do it now. And Baba would say, if you followed your dreams, I'll be here to back you 100%. It is Ramadan right now, the time for the Islamic month of fasting. I don't know how many of you know, but until just a few years ago, my dad, before his health deteriorated, he would fast every year on Ramadan. I also remember him crossing himself when he passed churches. We children made fun of him when we were young, but I'll tell you one thing, he made an impression on us. He taught us to respect each other's religions. He taught us that we were all one humanity. My dad didn't so much love religion. In fact, he resented religious dogma of every kind, and he bristled at anything that smacked of control. But he was deeply respectful of human beings and what matters to them. And he took great pride in the international nature of our extended family. We represented a number of religions and ethnicities and included ancestry that was not only Iranian, but Russian, Chinese, Euro-Americans. We're just missing a couple continents and religions, but perhaps the grandchildren can remedy that. So what would Baba tell us now? He would say, do not create false separations. He would say, celebrate and enjoy your colorful differences, but at the same time, don't forget the truth of your underlying unity. We are one human family. What else would Baba say? He would say, help the underdog, lift up those who are downtrodden, and above all, unleash the power of girls and women. Give them an honored seat at the table. He took pride in the accomplishment of women everywhere, but he took a special pride in the achievements of Iranian women, and used to tell me that he thought it would be the women of Iran who would one day lead the country out of its present predicament. After the last US elections, my father lost interest in politics. He stopped reading and he stopped engaging in the world. He withdrew more and more. His mind was affected, and some would call that dementia, but I saw it as his soul retreating from his physical form. He was about 85% gone most of this past year. At that point, I knew each moment spent with him was precious. I found that every time I visited him, even in the state he was in, he would surprise me with words of wisdom. He would seem to say exactly what I needed to hear. For example, I was going to Vienna, Austria this past February and would miss his birthday. It was a UN meeting on preventing atrocities, and I had mixed feelings about going, feeling insecure, not sure I would be able to contribute to the dialogue, and regretting that I would miss his birthday. As I was leaving my parents' home, saying my farewells before the trip, he didn't really recall where Vienna, Austria was, or what I was doing, and even though I tried to explain, but as he gave me kisses on both cheeks, he held me close and said, don't forget, Sousan, your presence is enough. That's what Baba would tell us now. Make sure you show up. Your presence is enough. You can imagine how much I dreaded this moment without my dad, without my North Star. I've spent a night at the hospice 2 nights before he died. I was in and out of sleep, and close to dawn, I was in one of those states of wakefulness and sleep, and I had a dream about him. He was sitting in a garden, a bahçe, and he was young, younger than I am now, with thick black hair and handsome, without glasses, beautiful, bright smile. The birds were singing, and he sat under a trellis of grapevines, and nearby the cypress trees were swaying in the breeze. And when he saw me, he lit up and laughed with joy, beckoned me to sit next to him. He pointed to something in the distance, and I knew he was pointing to his body that was in a coma in the hospice room, where I slept in a chair. I could hear his labored breath in the distance. That over there, he said, pointing emphatically, is my shell. Here, I'm free. He began laughing. It was a lighter, more buoyant father, a father I had never known. But I'll miss that shell, I protested in my dream. I'll miss you, Dad. I'll miss seeing you, touching you, hearing your voice, your laugh. I'll miss you, Dad. My darling, he said, whenever you want, come visit me in the garden. I'll be here. I'll be waiting for you. I was lucky to have him as my dad, but he had such a big and generous heart. He was capable of being Baba to many. If you want, you can visit him as well. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a garden. He'll meet us there. Thank you.